Hey, hi again, crew. Today we're going to keep going with Mr. Popper's Penguins. If you remember last time we were reading, we found out that Mr. Popper is married. He has two kids, Janie and Bill, and he is a house painter. And he lives in a small town, but he wants to see the world. He especially was interested in what was going on in Antarctica with Admiral Drake, who had taken an expedition to Antarctica and Mr. Popper had seen films about penguins and the ice and all the different things that he had done. And so Mr. Popper was kind of excited about that. And he had just gotten a message over the radio from Admiral Drake saying, thank you for your letter and watch for an answer, but not by letter, Mr. Popper. Watch for a surprise. So today, let's see if we get to find out what that surprise was. So we're going to start, as I get my chair set up here. Oh, that's so much better. We're going to check out what the surprise is in Chapter 3, Out of the Antarctic. What with the excitement of having the great Admiral Drake speak to him over the radio and his curiosity about the Admiral's message to him, Mr. Popper did not sleep very well that night. He did not see what would possibly wait to find what he could... Let's start that sentence again. He did not see how he could possibly wait to find out what the Admiral meant. When morning came, he was almost sorry that he had nowhere to go. No houses to paint, no rooms to paper. It would have helped to pass the time. "Would you like the living room papered over?" he asked Mrs. Popper. "I have quite a lot of paper number 88 left over from the mayor's house." "I would not," said Mrs. Popper firmly. "The paper on now is plenty good enough. I am going to the first meeting of the Ladies' Aid and Missionary Society today, and I don't want any mess around to clean up when I get home." "Very well, my love," said Mr. Popper meekly, and he settled down with his pipe, his globe, and his book of Antarctic adventures. But somehow, as he read today, he could not keep his mind on the printed words. His thought kept straying away to Admiral Drake. What could he have meant by a surprise from Mr. Popper? Fortunately for his peace of mind, he did not have to wait so very long. That afternoon, while Mrs. Popper was still away at her meeting, and Janie and Bill had not yet come home from school, there was a loud ring at the front door. "I suppose it is just the postman. I won't bother to answer it," he said to himself. The bell rang again, a little louder this time. Grumbling to himself, Mr. Popper went to the door. It was not the postman who stood there. It was an expressman with the largest box Mr. Popper had ever seen. Now, realize the postman would be like a mailman. That's what we would call it. An expressman would be like somebody showing up at your house from FedEx or UPS delivering a package in that way. So this is a little different. He wasn't expecting UPS or FedEx or somebody like that showing up. "Party by the name of Popper live here?" "That's me." "Well, here's a package that's come Air Express all the way from Antarctica. Some journey, I'll say." Mr. Popper signed the receipt and examined the box. It was covered all over with markings. "Unpack at once," said one. "Keep cool," said another. He noticed that the box was punched here and there with air holes. You could imagine that once he had the box inside the house, Mr. Popper lost no time in getting the screwdriver, for by this time, of course, he had guessed that it was a surprise from Admiral Drake. He had succeeded in removing the outer boards and part of the packing, which was a layer of dry ice, when from the depths of the packing case he suddenly heard a faint "ork." His heart stood still. Surely he had heard that sound before at the Drake expedition movies. His hands were trembling so that he could hardly lift off the last of the wrappings. There was not the slightest doubt about it. It was a penguin. Mr. Popper was speechless with delight. But the penguin was not speechless. "Ork!" it said again, and this time it held out its flippers and jumped over the packing debris. It was a stout little fellow, about 2.5 feet high. Although it was about the size of a small child, it looked much more like a little gentleman, with its smooth white waistcoat in front and its long black tailcoat dragging a little behind. Its eyes were set in 2 white circles in its black head. It turned its head from one side to the other, as first with one eye and then with the other it examined Mr. Popper. Mr. Popper had read that penguins are extremely curious, and he soon found that this was true. For stepping out, the visitor began to inspect the house. Down the hall it went and into the bedrooms, with his strange, pompous little strut. When it, or he, Mr. Popper had already begun to think of it as a he, got to the bathroom, it looked around with a pleased expression on its face. Perhaps, thought Mr. Popper, all that white tiling reminds him of the ice and snow at the South Pole. Poor thing, maybe he's thirsty. Carefully, Mr. Popper began to fill the bathtub with cold water. This was a little difficult because the inquisitive bird kept reaching over and trying to bite the faucets with its sharp red beak. Finally, however, he succeeded in getting the tub all filled. Since the penguin kept looking over, Mr. Popper picked it up and dropped it in. Then the penguin seemed not to mind. Anyway, you're not shy, said Mr. Popper. I guess you're sort of used to playing around with those explorers at the pole. When he thought the penguin had had enough of a bath, he drew out the stopper. He was just wondering what to do next when Janie and Bill burst in from school. Papa, they shouted together at the bathroom door. What is it? Oh, it's a South Pole penguin sent to me by Admiral Drake. Look, said Bill, it's marching. The delighted penguin was indeed marching. With little pleased nods of his handsome black head, he was parading up and down the inside of the bathtub. Sometimes he seemed to be counting the steps it took. 6 steps for the length, 2 steps for the width, 6 steps for the length again, and 2 more for the width. For such a big bird, he takes awfully small steps, said Bill. And look how his little black coat drags behind. It almost looks as if it were too big for him, said Janie. But the penguin was tired of marching. This time, when it got to the end of the tub, it decided to jump up the slippery curve. Then it turned, and with outstretched flipper, tobogganed down on its white stomach. They could see those flippers, which were black on the outside, like the sleeves of a tailcoat, were white underneath. Look, look, said the penguin, trying its new game again and again. What's its name, Papa? Asked Janie. Look, look, said the penguin, sliding down once more on his glossy white stomach. It sounds something like Cook, said Mr. Popper. Why, that's it. Of course. We'll call him Cook. Captain Cook. Chapter 4. Captain Cook. Call who Captain Cook? Asked Mrs. Popper, who had come in so quietly that none of them had heard her. Why, the penguin, said Mr. Popper. I was just saying, he went on, as Mrs. Popper sat down suddenly on the floor to recover from her surprise, that we'd name him after Captain Cook. He was a famous English explorer who lived about the time of the American Revolution. He sailed all over where no one had ever been before. He did actually get to the South Pole, of course, but he made a lot of important scientific discoveries about the Antarctic regions. He was a brave man and a kind leader, so I think Captain Cook would be a very suitable name for our penguin here. Well, I never, said Mrs. Popper. Nork, said Captain Cook, suddenly getting lively again. With a flap of his flippers, he jumped from the tub to the washstand and stood there for a minute surveying the floor. Then he jumped down, walked over to Mrs. Popper, and began to peck her ankle. Stop it, Papa! Screamed Mrs. Popper, retreating into the hallway with Captain Cook after her, and Mr. Popper and the children following. In the living room she paused. So did Captain Cook, for he was delighted with the room. Now a penguin may look very strange in a living room, but a living room looks very strange to a penguin. Even Mrs. Popper had to smile as they watched Captain Cook, with a light of curiosity in his excited circular eyes, and his black tailcoat dragging pompously behind his little pinkish feet, strut from one upholstered chair to another, pecking at each to see what it was made of. Then he turned suddenly and marched out to the kitchen. Maybe he's hungry, said Janie. Captain Cook immediately marched up to the refrigerator. Gork, he inquired, turning to slant his head wisely at Mrs. Popper and looking at her pleadingly with his right eye. He certainly is cute, she said. I guess I'll have to forgive him for biting my ankle. He probably only did it out of curiosity. Anyway, he's a nice, clean-looking bird. Mork, repeated the penguin, nibbling at the metal handle of the refrigerator door with his upstretched beak. Mr. Popper opened the door for him, and Captain Cook stood very high and leaned his sleek black head back so he could see inside. Now that Mr. Popper's work was over for the winter, the icebox was not quite so full as usual. But the penguin did not know that. "What do you suppose he likes to eat?" asked Mrs. Popper. "Well, let's see," said Mr. Popper as he removed all the food and set it on the kitchen table. "Now then, Captain Cook, take a look." The penguin jumped onto a chair and from there onto the edge of the table, flapping his flippers again to recover his balance. Then he walked solemnly around the table and between the dishes of food, inspecting everything with the greatest interest, though he touched nothing. Finally, he stood very erect, raised his beak to point at the ceiling, and made a loud, almost purring sound. He trilled. "That's a penguin's way of saying how pleased it is," said Mr. Popper, who had read about it in his Antarctic books. Apparently, however, what Captain Cook wanted to show was that he was pleased with their kindness rather than with the food. For now, to their surprise, he jumped down and walked into the dining room. "I know," said Mr. Popper. "We ought to have some seafood for him. Canned shrimps or something. Or maybe he isn't hungry yet. I've read that penguins can go for a month without food." "Mama, Papa," called Bill, "come see what Captain Cook has done." Captain Cook had done it all right. He had discovered the bowl of goldfish on the dining room windowsill. By the time Mrs. Popper reached over to lift him away, he had already swallowed the last of the goldfish. "Bad, bad penguin," reproved Mrs. Popper, glaring down at Captain Cook. Captain Cook squatted guiltily on the carpet and tried to make himself look small. "He knows he's done wrong," said Mr. Popper. "Isn't he smart?" "Maybe we can train him," said Mrs. Popper. "Bad, naughty Captain," she said to the penguin in a loud voice. "Bad to eat the goldfish." And she spanked him on his round black head. Before she could do that again, Captain Cook hastily waddled out to the kitchen. There the Poppers found him trying to hide in the still open refrigerator. He was squatting under the ice cube coils, under which he could barely squeeze, sitting down. His round white circled eyes looked at them mysteriously from the dimness of the inside of the box. "I think that's about the right temperature for him at that," said Mr. Popper. "We could let him sleep there at night." "But where will I put the food?" said Mrs. Popper. "Oh, I guess we can get another icebox for the food," said Mr. Popper. "Look," said Janie, "he's gone to sleep." Mr. Popper turned the cold control switch to its coldest so that Captain Cook could sleep more comfortably. Then he left the door ajar so that the penguin would have plenty of fresh air to breathe. Now let's just stop for a second and talk about what an icebox is. And an icebox is what they would call the refrigerator. An icebox used to look something like that. It used to just look like a cupboard. And there was a box on the top and a box on the bottom. The box on the top you actually put a block of ice into, and then it would keep everything in the bottom box or bottom part of the cupboard cold. And then when an ice cube melted all the way, then you would get another block of ice to put in there. And so in a refrigerator, an electric one like you would have in your house originally was made and people had them. They still called them ice boxes, but they were refrigerators kind of like what we have now. So this ice box, the freezer part, is where Captain Cook has found is going to work for him, because it would feel a lot like, Antarctica, where he's from. So that's where he is at. But that's why they keep calling it an ice box, even though we would call it a refrigerator and a freezer. Okay? All right, back to it. They left the door ajar so the penguin would have plenty of fresh air to breathe. "Tomorrow I will have the icebox service department send a man out to bore some holes in the door for air," he said. "And then he can put a handle on the inside of the door so that Captain Cook can go in and out of his refrigerator as he pleases." "Well, dear me, I never thought we would have a penguin for a pet," said Mrs. Popper. "Still, he behaves pretty well on the whole, and he is so nice and clean that perhaps he will be a good example to you and the children. And now, I declare we must get busy. We haven't done anything but watch the bird. Papa, will you just help me to set the beans on the table, please?" "Just a minute," answered Mr. Popper. "I just happen to think that Captain Cook will not feel right on the floor of that icebox. Penguins make their nests of pebbles and stones. So I will just take some ice cubes out of the tray and put them under him. That way he will be more comfortable." And we'll stop there. Chapter 5 is called Troubles with a Penguin, and we'll check that out tomorrow. So, Mr. Popper now has a pet, a penguin. Now, if you remember back to the beginning, Mrs. Popper was concerned because now, with Mr. Popper not painting, they're not going to be making as much money. And Mr. Popper's already decided on a couple of things they need. What were some things that he said they needed? Okay, icebox. So that's another refrigerator they're going to need to get. Those things are kind of expensive, even back in 1938 when the story is being written. Okay, can of shrimp. They talked about needing a can of shrimp. And that's going to be expensive too, because they're going to have to buy more food. It's just like having to buy dog food or cat food for your pets. That's an extra expense. And there was one other thing. Did you catch it? Well, they're going to have to hire someone to come in and bore holes, which means they're going to have to take a drill and make some holes in the refrigerator so that when the door is closed at night, Captain Cook can still breathe, the penguin. So a lot of expense coming in with having a pet. So Mr. Popper and this penguin, having a penguin in the house or a pet of any kind, is that a need or is that a want? Yeah, that's a want, right? So having a pet is a want, but now that you have this pet, it has needs as well. So your parents sometimes, when you ask things like, hey, can I get a goldfish, or can I get a dog, or can I get a pet cat or hamster, or things like this, keep in mind that mom and dad have to weigh what this new pet is going to need. Because a pet being a want, you don't have to have a pet. But once you have that pet, its needs are going to have to be met if you're going to keep it alive. So if you remember with Henry Huggins and with Herbie Jones, when we're reading those two books about them wanting a pet, one of the reasons that the moms and dads said no is probably because of the needs of this pet. And they were going to have to meet these needs. At our house, we have to meet the needs of our dogs. In fact, last night, Zeke had to bring them in so they didn't get caught out in the snow this morning. And this morning, Darby had to put them out and give them food, make sure they had water, and their kennels had to be put back out in the garage. Those are needs because we wanted pets. So we'll have to see what the troubles with the penguins are. Maybe the trouble with the penguin is going to be meeting the penguin's needs. So we'll see as we go on from there. Okay? Catch you next time. All right, bye.